attachment to outcome, attachment to pleasure, or just attachment. These are, or this is a principle, a concept within spiritual teaching that we might hear a lot about. We definitely hear a lot about it within this framework. And if we don't understand specifically what attachment to outcome means, then that very important concept could go being understood only superficially. So attachment to outcome really means that there is a relationship, an attitude towards outcome that says on a very deep and ingrained that outcomes specifically affect who I am. So that means that there is an attitude, a relationship that says I am interdependent on outcomes. And so if that relationship to outcome has been set in place by life through what we can call the new conditioning that life delivers at each moment. So if historically life has unfolded in a way that attachment to outcomes got set in place, then that is an attitude, a relationship between who you know you as or who you believe yourself as, and the outcome that says, I am complete, I will be complete because of outcome. So that relationship, that belief about outcomes that says outcomes will complete me. Outcomes are what eventually will deliver my happiness. Then we can say that is an ingrained attachment to outcomes. And that is part of the psychological identity. Psychological identity is essentially who we believe ourselves to be. So the belief I am dependent on, that I will be added to or subtracted from by pleasure in the, by outcomes, by consequences, by what happens in the flow of life, that attitude is attachment to outcome. It's therefore part of the psychological identity, part of what we believe to be the one that will be affected at a level of who I am by what the other does. Because what the other does is an outcome. By what I do and the outcome of what I do. So all of this then becomes important. The outcome very significant because we know outcomes. We relate to outcomes as being something that binds me, something that will come me. How fragile does that make us? We're essentially, one way of looking at it is you've got a noose around your neck linked to the flow of life, and you could look at it as though pain, a heavy weight, and pleasure is a light, a balloon filled with helium that lifts the rope up, but not with enough force that it can hurt you. But the heavy weight can pull down that will, threaten your life. So if that's the way we see outcomes, our self-image is this image of myself with this rope attached to outcome at the end of it. And if it's true, we think, okay, that's the balloon with the helium that just holds the rope in a non-offensive manner. But pain is this heavy weight at the end of the rope that can kill. And that's psychological. I'm not talking about the physical death of the body through, I use bad metaphors sometimes, the analogy of a rope, which suggests a physical death, but really that imagery is meant to be how we psychologically, the psychological image of myself. And so as soon as an outcome in life happens that is painful, not in line with my preference, then psychologically it feels like this is a threat to my life. And so we have to try to control life, and will inevitably resist life as if it is an attack on who we are when things don't work out the way. And the great news is we really are, at our core, is not at all affected by outcomes. So what we really are is independent of outcomes. Now, this is available for you to see. The description, what forward is a description of a dynamic. It's not there in order for you to change the dynamic. I'm not suggesting, you shouldn't be attached to outcomes. I'm saying we are or we aren't. And when we are, what that means, when there is attachment to outcome, what it means is there is a ingrained belief that drives us towards seeking outcomes with the expectation, the imagination that that is where my completeness and my happiness be found one day when things work out perfectly. And the good news is that what is really are is not dependent on outcomes. We're already that's why you sometimes hear we are already enlightened. We're seeking for what we are. That what that says, there is nothing missing. If we realize that there's nothing missing, we'll see that we were already whole. The deeply ingrained belief is so unconscious that it is there, which means it's not who we are. It's this other identity. And because it's there, it is moving outward. It is looking out uncomfortable. And so our comfortableness is covered up. Our comfortableness filled with uncomfortableness. So how does the comfortableness reveal itself? How does the happiness reveal itself? Uncomfortableness or the unhappiness dissolves. And that means the dissolving of that identity. Identity is a belief that is ingrained and a movement that comes from that belief. So that means the movement, the seeking outward, is essentially an extension of the belief. And sometimes the belief is so unconscious and so deep that we can't get to the belief. It's not accessible. It's like, trying to hand down a hole to get belief, but your hand isn't long enough to get down to where the belief is. So the other way of affecting the belief is by looking at the behavior, the outcome of the belief. So just like in the body, you can have pain in your hip. Pain is from some other injury in the body, let's say ankle, and the pain that you feel is in your, but the problem is actually in the ankle. And if you're familiar with where the origin of the pain is, one thing that can be done, treated, is to treat the area where the pain is manifesting. So if you can, for example, massage the area where the pain is manifesting, it can indirectly or directly change the root of that pain. And similarly, if you go to the root of the pain and you shift something at the root of the pain, then the expression will change. Of the pain and change the root, then where the pain is expressing itself, so the output can fall away. So essentially what I'm getting at is that it is two ends of the one system, and you can manipulate either end of the system and it will change the whole. And so our behavior is an extension of the ingrained attachment to outcomes. And so in order to affect the ingrained attachment to outcomes, it might be necessary to start looking at behaviors and for something to start interfering with the behavior. And if the behavior is modified, then that by default is changing the. So one of the movements of attachment to outcome is the inability to move slowly. We rush around. And in a way, we put it down to, well, I've got a busy day. But a busy day is quite possibly linked to our deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes. And there are going to be some times when we're busy, but if we find our whole life is rushing around, our whole life is fast paced, then it probably means that attachment to outcome is driving our life. And if that's the standard, then it means attachment to outcome is there and is what is primary. On the other hand, if what is primary is moving in a pace where everything adjusts to normal speed, and that's your standard, then occasionally you're going to have to rush because every now and again things are lined up where you can just squeeze two things in, but you're going to have to rush between one and the other. And if that happens sometimes, then that's understandable. If the whole life is about rushing, then you have to notice, there's a different standard here. And with the flow tends to mean aligning to a position where the body isn't always rushing, because rushing is not rushing is not in harmony. It means some thinking is trying to squeeze more things in than fit comfortably. And why is that? Why are we trying to fit more things in? And we might say, oh, well, it's because, my daughter has this at this time and this at this time, and my son has these activities on, and I have to take her there first. And then hold on. I understand there's a rationale for it, but maybe that can change. And the question is, are we willing to prioritize slowing down? And if we're not, it might mean that we're not because there's attachment to outcome. So I say this because my seeking was driven based on sensitivity to suffering. And one thing I noticed is that peace of mind was not there when there was rushing. And so I looked at how I would schedule things, and I'd find I'd schedule things with sort of just enough theoretical time between one and the other, which meant no space to, for example, go to the toilet after a meeting. It's like that hadn't been factored into the timing between events. And no time to just sit down and have a rest, for example. And so I thought, okay, this is not something that is sustainable, not something that I want to be sustained, rather. And so it just means a conscious adding in an extra 10 minutes in between meetings, for example, that you normally wouldn't put in because you think you don't need it. And in practice, you find that because that extra 10 minutes isn't there, then there's rushing. And so it might just be this thing is that, okay, so if I leave 15 minutes between appointments or between events, just increase it to 30 minutes. Someone says, well, if I do that, I'm going to get less things in the day, more peace of mind. It's about slowing down and allowing the consequences to fit in and say, oh, well, maybe I've got my how life should look that is influencing my behavior. And so, well, what if I drop the shoulds and shouldn't and just go to a much more practical indicator of what is optimal and accept the consequences of that as being an adjustment back to harmony. But if we're attached to outcomes, we might look at a consequence of slowing down and find, oh, I can only do 8 appointments a day instead of 12 appointments in the day. And then someone might say, well, that reduces my income by 35%. I said, well, maybe your need for that extra 35% income is based on a lifestyle and a way of interacting with life that is not in balance. And maybe it's coming from attachment to outcomes, where a whole lot of activities and a whole lot of indulging in certain pleasures have been put in place because it's believed that that's where happiness will come from. And so the consequence of losing that income and then not being able to indulge in those pleasures may actually be a consequence that is bringing the system back into line. So another example of this is to start doing what you feel like, and actually slowing down when we really start feeling into what do I feel like. The body says, I feel like slowing down, and you're always driving me to rush because of the tightness of the things that you've packed into the day. And so if we do what we feel like, the body says, oh, I'd love to be able to have a 10-minute rest in between things. I'd love to be able to walk from here to there instead of have to jog from here to there to get there on time. We might find that the um, the suffering, the thing that disturbs the peace of mind, is because we're rushing and we're imagining the person when we get there that we're 15 minutes late or 10 minutes late. And so we're in the car, and instead of being relaxed, we're sort of quick, get out of my way, and we're agitated and anxious. And then we're running over a story about what I'm going to say. We're thinking about what the other person is thinking about me. Um, so there can be this anxiety, this shame for not getting there on time, a blame towards the other person for the imagination of them blaming us for being late. And we say, well, you don't know how busy my life is. I've got so much. And so all of that noise is filling the space um, in between one activity and the next activity. And so maybe that's why there is less peace of mind. That's why when we slow down, it's not necessarily the slowing down, but it's about what slowing down prevents from happening. It means, let me slow down. I'll get to things on time. I won't have to feel anxious. I won't have to be in resistance to the car that is going slow in front of me because I have time. So then the car going slow in front of me is acceptable because it's not getting in the way of my objective, which is to get there on time, and it's a tight time frame. So if we have a less tight time frame, then the car in front of me can go slow, and it's not affecting the pleasure or pain in my life. So saying no to activities that we don't feel, that we don't enjoy. We might not even realize we don't enjoy certain activities. For example, in my life, I used to play golf and wake up early to meet friends on a Saturday morning. And waking up at that time wasn't what I really wanted. By the seventh hole, I was wishing that the game was over. And it took me 10 years of doing that to realize that what in my head was a pleasurable activity because it was meeting friends and it's playing sport, in practice, I was actually, I don't enjoy it. And to realize that is very important. And then for us to be able to say no to the invitation, are we able to say, well, the truth is, I'm not going to join for golf because I don't really enjoy it. And so that's an aligning based on a connecting to what is really the case instead of our imagination. Theoretically, this is pleasure. We might say, oh, it's meeting friends, it's playing sport. So in our head, those things are fun. In practice, we might not realize that they're not so fun. attachment to outcome, um, may, or we might be driven outwards because sitting still and going slow feels uncomfortable. So that's also something to look at, because um, at some point, if that's the case, the answer isn't to keep running away from the uncomfortableness, but the answer is to um, inquire into what is this that arises when I slow down. I'm not exactly sedentary, I guess. I wouldn't say that. There are times when I'm quite active doing fairly strenuous activity, but there's many times when I'm so pleased to just sit down. If I see a seat, I usually sit in it. Um, and if it's time to get up from the seat to go, if a group is going, I often feel like, oh, I'd like to stay in this seat for a bit longer. So I think that just sitting still, looking with not much to do, is um, something that we need to feel comfortable doing at least time. So it doesn't have to be that you're always sitting down, um, hoping for nothing to have, not having to do anything. But if you can't appreciate sitting down, then that's an indication of the fact that there's probably an uncomfortableness that arises when you sit and slow down, and then automatically we feel that, and so we speed up just to cover up that uncomfortableness. And so if that's the case, and that can sometimes lead to um, the doer wanting to do self-inquiry, wanting to investigate, saying, I get that I'm not the doer, but it isn't um, it isn't the uncomfortableness that's there. And if that's the case, it's usually because um, the the concepts are being turned into an activity that um, I will understand intellectually, and that activity is in itself the suffering energy arising. So it's we're wondering, how come the suffering isn't um, dissolving, even though I understand the concepts? And if it is another layer of suffering energy coming up, using the concepts as essentially a way of dealing with the uncomfortableness, then the answer, well, it's not necessarily an answer, but because we don't really know how, but my suggestion is to that person, you have to stop, because you're using the concepts, you've turned them into, they've become hollow in a sense, because they've been picked up as something that will get rid of this uncomfortable feeling. And that means they're not really being applied on the level at which point they can make a difference. They're being turned into a reason for this suffering energy to keep being active through the inquiry. And so it's like, stop. And if that's the case, it's stop and there'll be this agitation. It's like, and the agitation is there because stopping means one comes in contact with an uncomfortableness, not an uncomfortableness of the seeking, using the concepts because we've stopped that, but the uncomfortableness that has inspired the seeking and the use of the concepts in a way that is never really going to affect that. What needs to happen is it's like, okay, put everything down and realize that there is this agitation, this movement, and that is driving you to seek answers in the teaching. And in putting the teaching down for a while and remaining aware of this means that now that can be witnessed, that can be felt. And we will be interested in seeing what it is. What is that anxiety? What is that restlessness? Because the suggestion is that's not who you are. That is an uncomfortable movement. And what you are is that can be aware of that uncomfortable movement. And until we do find sitting quietly watching that as an object, essentially, not what we are, until that shift happens, that essentially turns into the moving around the house, the thinking about the concepts. And it's morphed from that uncomfortableness into an activity, and it could be a thinking activity that is essentially trying to cover up that uncomfortableness. And we believe that's who I am. It's like, oh, I'm the one thinking about attachment to outcome and doership, and I get I'm not the doer, is what that thinking will say. But how come it's not changing how I feel about life? And so when that happens, we know ourselves as that thinking, whereas that thinking is just an expression, just a new layer of the uncomfortableness that I'm suggesting stop and be that which is aware of the uncomfortableness. And so to repeat, when we're not aware of being the one aware, the thing or the one aware of the uncomfortableness, we are the uncomfortableness, and the uncomfortableness can, let's say, move into a seeking, a thinking about things, and then it feels like I am the thinker that is thinking about the spiritual teaching concepts. And in fact, that thinking about the spiritual teaching concepts is the suffering energy expressing itself. And that can happen through, that can be seeking for many people is the doership energy, seeking. And the concepts then won't really penetrate deeply. As soon as the concept starts seeing, as soon as the working mind starts seeing in action what the concepts are pointing at, then that's different, because then it's not the suffering energy morphing into seeking, which really means lost in the world of thought, but it's the working mind seeing the pleasure and the pain, seeing the suffering, seeing the doership at the base of the suffering. And that requires a feeling and a capacity to have stepped back in order to feel and know the certain feelings or experiences as what is described by the concepts. So, oh, that is pleasure in the moment. That is pain in the moment. Oh, there is blame. It's blame towards my parent or my sibling for how they respond to me, how they've always responded to me. You know, they don't respond to me with sort of understanding or respect, or um, and we see, oh, this is blame towards them for being a certain way, and a blame towards them for being a certain way that delivers pain to me. So as that is felt and seen, then that's a good indication that the seeking is not the doership energy um, turning into what we think is seeking, but is actually the doer seeking. So in essence, something slow down, change the behaviors that don't allow a slowing down, to the point where it might mean saying to your child, look, we can't do so many activities because uh, it it it's making me rush too much. It might be about finding different solutions as to how um, the timetable can be worked out. And we can either just say, oh no, that's not an option. I'm very happy that not being an option. I don't mind. I think everyone should do what they feel like doing. But I am suggesting that if our attitude or our priorities leaves us rushing around, there's a fairly good chance that there's attachment to outcome in there. So if it doesn't feel palatable or possible to change one's behavior, then essentially it means the ingrained attachment to outcome is being reinforced every time we say, yes, this is a valid way of setting up the week. And the same goes with the job that we do, how much time we put into our work, how many hours a week we um, are willing to work. So you might have someone that does an 80-hour week. And there's a good chance that that's not delivering um, a feeling of alignment in their life. And yet it keeps happening year after year after year. And each year they say, oh, I should reduce my workload so that I can get on with doing some other activities. And next year, same thing. And the year after, same thing. And maybe that's a habit being driven by a priority of certain things that are not really as important as they've been prioritized, which is heading back to this attachment to outcome, which is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So, are you willing to cut your salary in half? And then someone said, oh, I can't do that because then I won't be able to pay the mortgage. You might be, you're right, but why is it um, you're living in the suburb that is, let's say, in the top quartile of expensive real estate? And maybe that's because of a deeply ingrained attachment to outcome. So these are just suggestions of what we need to be willing to look at. Because if we don't change if we don't find that the expression of doership and attachment to outcome is changed, if that doesn't actually change, then the concepts are simply remaining on the surface. The point is for um, the concepts to penetrate deeply into the system such that they start uprooting the beliefs about who we are. Our peace of mind, which is what in this teaching is said to be what's available as human happiness, peace of mind, the end of suffering. So peace of mind is the absence, the falling away, what is there when suffering, guilt, pain, pride, worry, and expectation. And when that falls away, there's peace of mind. And that's what's said to be available in the form of happiness for the human being. And that peace of mind comes when there is a connection to source. So recognizing our unbroken connection to source leads to peace of mind. Recognizing our unbroken connection to source means understanding that whatever I say, whatever I do, whatever I feel is happening because source is functioning through me. That all of life is a movement because of source. So the clouds are moving because of source, and the feelings, the thoughts, the words are moved because source is functioning through me. And that means the sense of separation, which is there when we don't recognize our connection to source. When our connection to source is not felt, is not known, is not understood, then we feel alone and separate, isolated, as if we are a independent human being that is in complete control of everything that happens, which sounds like a good thing. Oh, I'm in control. But feeling like we're in control means that we feel separate. So realizing that I'm not in control, life is living me, that to the thinking mind that wants to be in control, because that means that there's a chance that it'll get the life that it thinks it needs in order to be happy, realize we're not in control, to the thinking mind seems like really bad news. What it really is the dissolving of me that is the doer, that thinks it's making life happen. And that is a dissolving that can create a great relief. It's like, what a relief. I can slow down. I can slow down and allow the consequences to happen and see that the consequences are simply God's will unfolding. And so there's no reason to not slow down. If that's what destiny brings in a particular moment, then the consequences are essentially not my doing, but what is destined to happen. So essentially you say, well, I can do one of two things. I can go fast or I can go slow, both of which are destiny happening, and the consequences are both destiny happening. So you might as well pick the one that feels better. And so none of it is your doing. So why not go with the one that is better? And understand that the moment where you go, actually, I'm going to slow down from now on. I've been moving too fast. Understand that that decision, that thought, is a happening, it's destiny because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Your up-to-date conditioning includes the body having registered for years what it feels like to move fast. The body has been given intuitively, you know, probably that I really need to slow down. I'm quite sure that this time, for some people, has been really quite precious. The last few months where there has been less to do. And on the flip side, I'm sure that this time has been excruciating for some people, confined to be with themselves, and excruciating, but I'm also sure it's been very fruitful at seeing certain things that as the time at home comes to an end for more and more people, hopefully the lessons are learned and it isn't just a switch back to the old habit. So hopefully some lessons are learned and some changes come into place. So meditating is not something that I talk much about. It isn't something that I say you should meditate as a practice, because often we hear that and we think, okay, just tell me what I should do and I'll do it. And that once again is the doer wanting to find out from life how they can control the outcome. And I don't know what the outcome is, so I don't know what to say to someone as far as they should or shouldn't do this. If I'm asked by someone, what should I make this decision or that decision? I thought, I don't know. Really, what I suggest is you do whatever you think or feel is right. And often that isn't what the person wants to hear. They want to know whether to go left or right. I say, I don't know what destiny is. If I tell you to go left, that's almost me saying, I know that destiny has you going left. I say, I don't know whether destiny has you going left or right. So why don't you do what you think or feel? And then I know that whatever you think or feel is what um, is destiny unfolding. Now, we can argue the same thing, is that if the person says, tell me to go left or right, and I say go left, and they go left, then that's destiny unfolding. It is, because that's what has happened. But what's more authentic for me is to say, actually, I don't know, you don't know. So let's let destiny unfold. And how does destiny unfold? It unfolds by someone doing what they think or feel to do. Now, if someone is functioning from thinking and thinking this is what I should do and this is what I shouldn't do, then that too is destiny. But what I think we find is that life is much more of a flow. We feel much more aligned when we start taking our instructions from a place of feeling rather than a place of thinking what we should and shouldn't do. So if someone says to me, what should I do? I mean, I'd rather, given I feel like there's a more of a flow when we start doing what we feel like, I'd rather say, look, I don't want to tell you what you should do, because I don't think that's a way that I'd like to encourage people to ask, what should I do? I'd much rather encourage someone to do what they feel like, understanding that that is one of the ways that instructions from God are delivered. Instructions from God are also delivered in terms of, oh, I should do this, I shouldn't do that, because that's one of the ways that destiny unfolds, through that thought arising and then that person functioning that way. What I found is that God sends instructions in those two ways. When we follow the instruction about what coming from what I feel like, we feel like we're in flow, in alignment with life. When I follow the instruction from what I should or shouldn't do, which is still God giving the instruction, it means living life as destined, but without the feeling of being in flow. So meditation. I won't say to someone, oh, I think you should meditate, because I don't know that that's what destiny in flow for that person looks like. What I will say is that meditation does serve a very useful role in becoming familiar with your internal landscape. I found that a meditation, a sitting with eyes closed meditation, started happening quite late in the process, after awakening, or after certain significant shifts happen. So what would seem to me, after quite a lot of recognition and changes had taken place. However, I'm referring to a sitting meditation. What I did find a lot of prior to the sitting meditations coming in was walking meditations. Not walking meditations as in the Buddhist practice, which is also fine, but it's not the practice I'm talking about. I mean, just walking in the park. I'd walk round and round and round a particular park, taking in the trees and the birds and flowers, and thinking, contemplating, working mind. What does Ramesh mean by this line? And thinking about the Chinese farmer proverb, and all sorts of other sayings and quotes, and really seeing how they all pointed into the same thing. So lots of churning through and understanding how what something meant. So a lot of thinking, but thinking in a way where the thinking was seen, where it was clear that thinking is happening. And so being clear that thinking is happening is just about, it's a matter of being aware that you are thinking about a proverb or a saying or a recording that you heard, and being aware that you're thinking about it and processing it. Being aware of the fact that you're walking and the lake is on your right, and that you can see the tree, and that you are thinking about the proverb and being aware of all of these things at once. That means an awareness about what is going on. And if the walking, so I found that the walking inspired a witnessing, which really meant being especially familiar with the body functioning, the body, the hands moving, the legs moving, and seeing walking happening, and feelings of whatever it was, hunger, and see, oh, hunger is arising. So that to me was a form of meditation that seemed much more natural, effortless, whereas sitting down just never seemed like something I was drawn to, until a particular point where then sitting in sitting meditation just felt effortless. And I could sit down where previously sitting down for 20 minutes felt like it was a bit of a struggle, because it wasn't what I was naturally drawn to. And then at a certain point, it was I could sit down and 45 minutes would go past without it feeling like 5 minutes had gone past. And so at that point, I started seeing sitting meditation practice come in, but not a practice with someone doing it. It was simply a movement that often during the day felt like, oh, the perfect thing to do would be to close my eyes and just sit. And if that is happening, then so much of the inner landscape can be recognized. There can be a awareness of what we might have related to as, I don't know, the experience of the person sitting with their eyes closed. Attention may not have actually landed on the space that is there. And what I mean by that is to be aware of the space without saying, oh, that is um, anything to do with someone sitting. Because as soon as we think that this is me with my eyes closed, the space isn't really appreciated for what it is. We're actually not present with it. We're still thinking about a person with their eyes closed. So if attention is drawn into the present moment, we'll see there's no physical body in that space. And there's no physical body outside of that space. That space includes all of the sensations, which, if we're thinking, we would say, oh, that's the sensation of my thigh on the chair. But that's still based on reverting back to this assumption based on memory, instead of being really present with the experience as it's presenting itself. And in the experience, there is a vague sensation that, as soon as the labeling of it and based on memory comes in and says, oh, that sensation is of my thigh on the chair, then there's a residual self-image, a residual world image that comes into the meditation. And if that's dropped, then there is a registering of this sensation and a realization. Actually, the sensation is really quite indistinct. It really tells you very little about what it is a sensation of if we aren't attributing a lot of labels based on memory. And that tends to open up access to the experience, the meditation experience, as it really is showing up. And if you find there's a sitting in meditation and it's, the notion that you've got another 5 minutes to sit in meditation is just sort of like, 5 minutes, that's such a long time. You might notice that uncomfortableness is, or that restlessness is there because of a certain thought about 5 minutes and how that doesn't seem to be what you want to be doing. And what we can find in the meditation is that once that's realized, that the uncomfortableness is linked directly to a certain type of thinking, that thinking might get transcended. It might be something that can fall away because the recognition of the ease at which the 5 minutes goes when that thinking falls away. And until it's seen that the restlessness of sitting for 5 minutes and the effort of sitting for 5 minutes, until it's seen that that is there because of thinking that says, I don't really feel like sitting for another 5 minutes or whatever, until it's seen to be the problem, there isn't a solution. And once it becomes clear, that's because of a certain thinking that the meditation feels a certain way, and might start happening that thinking gets cut off. And then we find, the 5 minutes went so quickly. And if the thinking hadn't got cut off, then the 5 minutes wouldn't have gone quickly, because it would be filled with essentially the same as what is referred to when a watched kettle never boils. Like if you're sitting there watching the kettle, it feels like it never boils. It's like, this 5 minutes is taking forever. Whereas if you forget about the kettle boiling and you start writing some notes, before you know it, the kettle starts whistling. Now, remember, that wasn't an instruction. It can sound like, why don't you, when you're in meditation, you stop thinking about how the next 10 minutes of meditation is going to be torturous because I really don't feel like sitting for 10 minutes. It's not an instruction to stop doing that thinking. It's a description of what might happen if it's seen as a result of seeing that thinking does create the uncomfortableness. And the seeing is not something, the seeing is not the instruction either, because it's a description of that happen. So even seeing that thinking creates uncomfortableness is not a prescription being given, but rather a description of what might happen if you find yourself sitting in meditation. So especially for those that are uncomfortable to sit in meditation, play around with it. I wouldn't say do it with extreme willpower, but even if you meditate for 4 minutes, 3 minutes, or a minute, even a 1 minute meditation, can reveal the uncomfortableness that says no, that you just meditation is the last thing you want to do. So I wouldn't say meditate when you don't feel like it, except as a little experiment, just for a very, very short period of time. So it's almost saying, do exactly what you feel like. And the fact that, it only has to be a 1-minute meditation may in fact mean, oh yeah, I feel like doing a 1-minute meditation. Even if I don't, I feel like it because I'm curious. So really it's, don't, in my view, pushing oneself is probably reinforcing the very dynamic I'm speaking of. Okay, well, let's see if there's any questions. Elliot or Elian?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. I have 3 questions actually, but I'm going to just try and single out one. Came as a bit of a shock. I didn't think about this before. One sec. Yeah, I was going to ask about regular practices, and I think you've just answered that question. In regards what I've done in the past, I have used sort of affirmations with the concepts. So, yeah, true happiness does not is not in outcomes, and all is just is happening. Really, I am not the doer, and I've done that with sort of a walking meditation, and it's I've found great results. But I found I've disengaged quite dramatically with any sort of discomfort. And but as you've said, coming back, what's happened has somehow the concept or the affirmation has lost it. It became sort of unable to be serving with the same sort of capacity for releasing, which was interesting. So I'm appreciating your comments on that. Making decisions. You also covered this today, but I have a specific decision that I wanted to make at the moment regarding relationships. I have no clear kind of straightforward sort of answer in my heart. It seems that the world around me is consistently sort of requesting that I really do make a decision. But when it comes down to it, I feel like not making the decision at all. And I'm aware that maybe that's the decision. And I suppose I've just realized while talking to you, I've kind of accepted that. Not while talking to you, by listening to you, I've accepted that I've made the decision to not make a decision. And instantly, yeah, quite a lot of the tension just fell away just then. Is there anything you want to say on that? Because I'm just kind of, yeah, I appreciate maybe something regarding this.
Yeah, I would affirm what you said, is that the decision or not making a decision is in fact a decision. Because if, for 5 pages of the book, it's destined for no decision to be made, then to recognize that the idea of making a decision while going through those 5 pages is nonsensical. It's just going to mean no decision is made because it's not destined for a decision to be made. But stress about thinking you need to make a decision will be there. So if we realize, well, if it's destined for there to be no decision in that 5 days, then essentially the decision is to make no decision.
Yeah.
That's how the 5 days of no decision goes. And then we must think, we tend to think, well, but I have to make a decision. And I say, exactly, a decision will happen. If you look at, you wake up for these 5 days, let's say, and there's no decision there. And then on the 6th day, you wake up and it's just so clear, because something's happened on the news, let's say, or someone has sent you a message, or just something has changed, and suddenly it's just so easy to make the decision. And if you start noting that, then you say, well, I just need to wait for the time that the decision is easy. And in the times when it's not easy, that's the sign that it's a decision to make no decision.
Right.
Which is essentially a long-winded way of saying what you just said.
No, thank you. It seems that I still appreciate some affirmation on this. Going back to the decision question, I suppose the issue arose when people would say that this is like an attribute of a healthy masculine side, or like being able to make decisions, right? It's like this has been something that I've had an issue with for a long time in my life. And, in sort of new age circles, I'm going to get this idea that this is very much like connected with healthy masculinity, and I think I just need to sort of accept that, because I'm not actually that bad at making decisions. when I know something, I want something, or this feels good, and straight away I change my behavior towards it. So yeah, all right. So thanks very much. But yeah, I think I could.
Another with decisions, sometimes because of our attachment to outcomes, we're so paralyzed because we feel we have to always make the decision that will deliver the best outcome, that we get paralyzed in being able to make a decision, because essentially we're so attached to making the right decision. And so if someone has an inclination that that's what's happening, I say, look, the truth is that your decision is just going to deliver a consequence or a result. And that result is either pleasure or pain, and your happiness isn't dependent on pleasure or pain. So Ramesh used to say, if you're indecisive and you feel like you need to make a decision, then toss a coin. So that was his solution, was hand it over to the coin and understand that it was your destiny to not be able to make a decisive decision, to resort to the suggestion of tossing a coin, go with whatever the coin says, understanding that the coin is delivering the answer that is your destiny. And he said, making a decision out of being calculated and considering, or making a decision from tossing a coin, equates to the same thing. It's just different mechanism by which destiny is bringing about a decision. I would add that if you do have the capability to make a calculated decision, then it could well be that the outcomes are going to be more in line with your calculations. So it doesn't mean that tossing a coin is going to give you the same consistency of sort of correlated outcomes. Yet the truth is, make a decision, the outcome is not in our control, whether we calculated it or not. So we can't think that. I'm very glad to have a calculating mind when it comes to decisions. I feel it serves me well. However, if I didn't have that calculating mind, then I'd have to go, well, that's just my makeup. I don't have the calculate. So I'm going to resort to some and see that other mechanism as destiny unfolding. So from from this perspective, whichever mechanism it is, it's God's will unfolding.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Roger.
You're very welcome.
And yeah, I just very much appreciate these teachings that come through you. Thank you.
Great. You're welcome. Thanks for saying. Hi, Holger.
Yes. Hello, Roger.
Hello.
Yes, I really like the word rush. You used the word rush today, rushing around. And this was for a long time like a mantra for me, where I asked myself, rush or hush? And this
Rush
was
or
quite
hush?
helpful. Yes, hush. I mean, for me, hush was just to slow down for a moment and to see really
Nice.
what's going on here. And this really worked, and it's quite fascinating. I don't have much to say right now. I just wanted to thank you for your satsang and all the things you speak. It's so fascinating for me to hear your clarity, because I can relate all to your words, but I wouldn't be able to speak them in this way. I mean, this is so fascinating to me, just to recognize something inside of me. I feel more often like a blur or something inside. I mean, I don't feel like I'm dreaming, but I'm just not. Yesterday, for example, I felt, oh, I'm so tired of thinking. And this was an interesting experience. I just had enough. I mean, because it's just regurgitating always the same and the same when there is no connection to the source. I mean, then it's just old, stale stuff. And so that's,
Yes.
I like the freshness of listening to you. It stirs up all this stuff, and there's so much light in it, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated why I don't get bored. You know, it's happened to me. It's happened that I've felt, oh, I've said this so many times. I think it's happened to me once or twice or maybe 3 or 4 times, I should say, in about 7 years. And a few times it's dawned on me as to, wow, this is really strange that I don't have that feeling much more often. And so the conclusion was, oh, well, it must always be fresh. To me, it's just coming out, because I can imagine if it wasn't fresh, if it wasn't coming out, and I was having to force it out, it wouldn't have a very long life. I wouldn't have a very long life doing this, if that was the case. So hopefully it is fresh. Hopefully that's what you get a sense of.
Yes, and yes, absolutely. And for a long time, I also I had always this like a mantra or something. I said always to myself, boredom is healthy.
Yeah. Okay. In what was your rationale? Boredom is healthy, right?
Yes, yes. In regard to not getting lost in involvement. I mean, not to get always excited about things, and just to to reacquaint myself with this inner part of myself which I'm not familiar. I mean, this what always just felt like darkness, and being in resistance to the expectations that I felt towards life that were put on me through my family or my upbringing and all this stuff. And so just to realign myself again with myself, hard to describe, and I don't just want to babble along here. I just want to say thank you, and talk to you another time.
Yeah, thank you, Holger. You're always welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hi, Walter.
Oh, hello. There we go. How you doing, Roger?
Yes, very well.
Yes, very well. Nice.
Good to see you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
down something you had said earlier in this talk, wanted to ask you about that. You said peace of mind comes when there's a connection to source. Source is functioning through me. It's felt, known, and understood. And I'll just leave it there. But I'd say that the felt, known, and understood is the part that I wanted to ask a question about.
Okay.
I feel really, I don't know how to say it, but I'll do more of the absence. In other words, of the doership, of the sense of doership, of the, I'd say if an absence can be felt, I would say the absence is felt, known, and understood, that I'm not the doer. But this presence of something else. Now, theoretically, I can assume something's doing all of this. So I have no problem, saying, oh, source is functioning through me, consciousness is all there is, or whatever. But I can't really say it's felt, known, and understood, what the source is. I don't, you know what I'm saying? If I feel anything, I just feel like things are happening and I'm doing things and life is, but I don't feel like I'm, anyway, I think you get my question.
I do, and it's very valid, and it's worth not taking what is said too literally, which your question in a way is pointing at, is that so to feel that I am being lived, or to feel that I am connected to source. So let me take the feel being lived out, but to feel that I'm connected to source might be too much of a stretch, like you're suggesting, if we take it literally. Then so what does it really mean? And it can very much mean a combination of the absence of the sense of doership, because the sense of doership creates often a sense of disconnection. That's what we can feel when we feel we're the doer. And so the absence of the disconnection can be described as a sense of connection. But in exactly the way you've described, is we know we feel connected simply because we don't feel disconnected. So we know the contrast. We can feel what disconnected is, and that falls away. And so then we can say, oh, well, I'll refer to that as the absence of disconnection, which is sort of interchangeable with connection. But it doesn't imply an overt sense of connection. So I think what I've just done is confirm or reaffirm what you're suggesting.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so that sense of connection comes very much with feeling. Once again, I'm using the word feeling loosely, feeling as though one is being lived. And to feel that you're being lived is in part strengthened by the seeing, as you said, that everything is just happening, that my hands are always moving. I shouldn't bring attention to that, because now everyone's going to look at my hands moving 95% of the time through the satsang. My attention is on my body functioning, and once it's seen to be really just happening, I'm not there making it happen, because that would be a lot of hard work for all these words to come out for 2 hours with someone making them happen. And so the more that we feel that the words are a result of this very complex process inside the skull, theoretically, or because source is popping words into my head or thoughts into my head that come out of words. Once that starts being felt, then we say, we by default say, I feel I'm being lived. And once again, it's not necessarily an overt sense, but really much more the absence of the alternative perspective. So thanks for the question, Walter.
I appreciate the answer, Roger. Have a great day or night or
Yes.
this evening where you are. Thank you.
Great. Hello, Isabel.
Hello, Roger. Let me put the video.
Yes. Nice to see you.
Yes, I'm very happy to see you. You were saying yesterday that you were excited to be there, and so am I. I was even I couldn't be there maybe last week or the week before because I moved from Paris, and then I realized I was clinging to your satsangs, and so I'm always happy to see you. And before I ask you my question, I really wanted you to know how much you changed my life. That's the shift that happened first when I met you 2 years ago, and then during those 3 last months where you've been offering those satsang. It's like something in my head just happens. I couldn't imagine before I could feel so peaceful, and so that's just amazing. It's amazing, really. So I first thank you for this. Really, really changes things. So my
this is lovely to hear.
Sorry.
I said that is very lovely to hear. Thank you for sharing.
Oh.
You know, Ramesh was always really, I think people didn't necessarily understand this so much because a lot of people wanted to share various experiences and various understandings. And he'd always just say, is it leading to more peace of mind in your life? That's what he was really interested in. So when you say what you just said, it's really, that's what it's all about. You know,
yes,
in practical terms, is it leading to more peace of mind?
So in fact, it's maybe 2 questions I have. It's about being peaceful and being happy. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel, so it's really like, even I don't know if it's okay to say that I'm sort of neutral. Things happen and mm-hmm. it's always okay. But then there's no joy, there's no sadness. It's like, I don't know how to call this.
The absence of suffering.
Yes. So the absence of suffering is so, but when you're happy, you are not suffering.
Yeah, but so it's just about the word and your definition of it, because very clearly in this teaching, and very specifically in this teaching, because if I had to use the word happiness in general terms, happiness means excitement for people, you know, that's what is meant by I feel happy because something good is happening. That's the general term for happiness. And in this teaching, we say, well, that's what most people think about happiness is pleasure. And so their assessment of happiness is pleasure. And what you're saying is, but, you know, my happiness, or rather, what I find is I have the absence of suffering, but I can't call it because there isn't any, or sometimes there isn't any joy or excitement. And that's because your definition of happiness is still linked to pleasure, right? Okay. So if I talk about, do you have peace of mind? You might say, okay, yes, peace of mind. I'm happy to say, yes, there's peace of mind, because peace of mind doesn't mean pleasure. It doesn't mean joy. It doesn't, because otherwise we wouldn't call it peace of mind, we'd call it joy or happiness. So, you're happy with the description of peace of mind or the absence of suffering, right?
Yes.
That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. In the teaching, we say happiness is peace of mind or the absence of suffering. In this teaching, happiness doesn't mean pleasure. So we are seeking happiness, but happiness isn't available in the form of pleasure, 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 which is the form of happiness most people know. And that's a very temporary happiness. That's not true, lasting happiness. So the teaching says true, lasting happiness for the human being is only available in the very simple form of peace of mind. That means happiness in this context doesn't include or doesn't refer to joy and excitement.
Okay.
Now, there's no reason why you can't be happy even when there is joy and excitement, because happy is peace of mind. So if you find that you are joyful and excited and there is peace of mind, then you are happy and joyful and excited.
Yes, okay. That sounds, I don't know how to say it. It's fine. I understand that. The other question is what you were saying about meditation. So I was wondering, I maybe meditate every morning 1 hour, and then sometime during the day I can stop and just because I feel it, just look around, and I call that meditation. I don't know. And sometime when I meet someone, it could be you, but I don't have that with you. I'm in front of someone, and then I see me talking to this person, and then I stop, because then I say there's something wrong. Seeing me, seeing you, and then I begin to get lost, because I'm not with you. I'm not with the person. And then I try to do the same thing, to stop and say, breathe, and it doesn't, and something has gone away and is lost. And that happens quite often. Maybe when I don't know, maybe when I'm not comfortable with someone, or when someone is new, or I don't know. And I don't know what to do in those circumstances. I would like to stop seeing me, seeing you. And I don't know how to do. I don't know how to do that.
Well, what you describe, I mean, if it feels uncomfortable or feels like something is not right, then maybe it isn't what I'm going to suggest, or it sounds like it's not, if it doesn't feel natural or effortless or aligned, because it sounds like this happens when you get nervous, or when you're not familiar with something, let's say, or if you don't like the person. So it seems like a bit of a withdrawing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But so what I was going to say, there is also a functioning of the human being that is this seeing me, seeing you, that where we function looking outward and inward simultaneously, which is where we are talking to the person and feeling like I am communicating with the person, and then simultaneously there is a witnessing of the body speaking to the person.
Exactly.
But that to me is really amazing. That's where we are both participating. And so on one level, we feel like I am the person. And simultaneously, there is not a being dragged out into circumstance and getting lost in circumstance, because the consciousness is simultaneously looking out and in at the same time, which means, in a way, I am both the one speaking and the one engaging with the other, and the one aware of everything that is happening. But that doesn't, to me, when that happens, that's almost like the best of both worlds. That's that is what I would say quite integrated functioning. So if what you're describing sort of feels like you're saying it feels like something's going wrong, right?
Yes, because it's like I was not in what's happening, what the person is telling me. It's not a way I'm not very aligned to this when you, so it's like, you know, floating, or just don't know where I sit really when this happens. And it's, for me, it's uncomfortable, I would say.
So the overriding thing I say is, if that happens, that's the story of life in that moment, designed to feel like that and designed to be like that. So the attitude is, it can be one of surrender to it being like that. That's the overriding principle. So you're not in resistance to it. You go, well, actually, if this is what's happening, it's like having a headache, you know, it's just,
okay.
c'est la vie. C'est la vie. And with that, you can also experiment and say, okay, well, maybe this is my way of escaping, my way of dissociating from something that I feel uncomfortable with. And so if you feel that happening, just consciously, in a way, say, okay, I'm going to be here with this. It's not going to kill me. And maybe that's a breaking of the habit that sends you into a dissociation or a detached place. And the more that you can come back to the place where it's uncomfortable, the more you might realize, actually, it's just a fear maybe taking me away. And yet I would still say that if it happens, if it is a fear and it happens, still the ultimate attitude is, oh, well, it's obviously destined for this to happen for a while.
And so I would not be uncomfortable anymore if I say that to myself. Just witness it.
Yeah. It's well, why not, c'est la vie?
Yes, c'est la vie. Okay, I'll try that. And I'm still a seeker. I wanted to say also, I'm still a seeker. And that doesn't make me unhappy. It doesn't take off my being peaceful, but I'm still seeking a lot. I wanted to.
Well, then that's the remaining uncomfortableness.
That's the remaining. Because when
maybe
when you're seeker,
you go.
When you're a seeker, you're always uncomfortable.
Not there is a degree of uncomfortableness, because, like, what are you seeking? You're seeking what feels like it is missing, and missing is a form of suffering. So the sense that something is missing. But from what you're saying, the seeking is not an intense seeking, meaning the suffering is not an intense suffering. So you might be a very earnest seeker, right? But the suffering component of your seeking is not so intense, because you've got this, you can talk about how life has changed for the better, how there is much more peace of mind. So that means that actually, my interpretation is, there is not much seeking, because if there was much seeking, there wouldn't be much peace of mind.
Well, it's I don't know about that. I'm always seeking about the same thing. But I like it. I like when you create something, it's like always to understand this oneness thing or not being separated. And it's like I feel you're right that there's something missing, but it's there. I could say c'est la vie. I don't bother about it. It's just I'm seeking. And so I just hope listening to you someday it will come into my mind. I wanted to say that.
Yeah, so that's a great attitude when the seeking is there, and you say actually it's not a problem. And in fact, there's a nice phase of the seeking where the seeking doesn't feel like suffering. Maybe in that phase it isn't really suffering. It's very useful at allowing us to get the information. Where you're but then at some point it's like you start feeling like I'm tired of this. I'm tired seeking. And that's a particular shift from what you describe, where you say, actually, I'm seeking, but I quite like it. It's quite fun and rewarding and exciting. And it shows me that there is this depth in life, and that's where my destiny is, to go into that. So it's very nice. I like being, I've said my seeking was like being on a magic carpet ride, it was amazing. The seeking process was amazing. Then somewhere there was a point where I felt the seeking was was suffering. And at that point, maybe attention lands on the fact that now one of the last remaining bits of suffering is this idea that there's more. And that's, the seeking then naturally comes to an end once the seeking starts to be felt like a problem, because we see it and we say, oh, stop, enough. And then even the seeking stops.
Well, that's maybe one day it will arise. So thank you again so much, Roger. And whatever you do, I will follow you. I can say that.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Yeah. You too. Bye. Hiya, Tim.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Good, good. I just wanted to say how grateful I am to have been coming to these satsangs for the entire time you've been doing them during the pandemic. It's a real blessing.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So my question is, it was more related to yesterday's talk, actually. But I was on Wikipedia looking at Ramesh's page, as one does, just for some biographical kind of information. And I came upon a quote that said in his teachings that, part of his teachings is all that happens is caused by the one source. And the actual identity of this source is pure consciousness, which is incapable of choosing or doing. And so that started making me think, about doership. I, think a lot about non-doership and letting go of my own doership, not through a process of doing non-doership, but what it made me think was, okay, as a biological entity, I am not the doer. But if source is incapable of choosing or doing, when we talk about God's will seems to imply that God is the doer. But when we speak of God, Ramesh also said that, a painting cannot know what the painter was intending, it's like our minds are, our brains are too puny to understand the vastness of all of creation. But at the same time, I wonder, like, is doership just a concept that comes up in human beings, and that, you know, God is not a doer either? Like, we ascribe this, oh, God's will, doership, but in fact, it might just be an explosion unfolding. And if, you know, we talk about the script being, you know, the movie being written, produced, directed, and in the can, but that implies like a director, a doer. And is God the doer?
Not my way of seeing it, or Ramesh's way. But what you're saying is exactly right. We tend to project onto God our understanding or misunderstanding of how life is. So that's what we do with animals. That, you know, the term anthropomorphizing is this projecting onto animals human emotions, that they may just not have them in the same way that the human imagines they have them. And so that's what we do with our concept of God, because God is just a concept as we hold it. We have a concept of God. And so if someone's concept of God is allowed controlling, then they have a concept of a doer, controller God that is doing life. And so when we talk about God's will, it's very easy for it to sound like, well, there must be a God that has a will and is exerting his whereas that's why in the teaching it's described as God hasn't created the universe, but rather God has become the universe. Because God creating the universe would imply a separate object created by the creator God. And so the saying that Ramesh would often put forward is that the created object can never know the creator source. And even that too, if we hear the word certain way, we will imply it means that there are two: the object that has been created, the creator that has created it. But if we look at a masterpiece, like even just a human master, like, I don't know, Leonardo da Vinci, whatever he creates is not separate from, even though in practice, you know, you can put it in a museum and it seems separate. But what this is really saying is that the masterpiece is not separate from the master. The masterpiece is the master in that form. And in the teaching concept, it's even more abstract than that. So it says infinite creative potentiality, the unmanifest source at rest, at a certain point in time explodes into manifestation and becomes source in movement, becomes the whole of the manifestation. And so once again, we might project onto that unmanifest some cognizant capability. We say, well, if it becomes the masterpiece of life, it must have chosen, and it must have thought it into creation, like decided what it wanted to create. Whereas I'd like to emphasize that because its nature is infinite creative potential, then that implies actually that a spontaneous non-cognizant movement can happen without God having an intention, simply because the nature is creative potential. So that means that whatever it actualizes into, which is just a impersonal movement, has to be creative. It has to be a creation. And creative implies, you know, interesting and complex. And so when we look at life, we go, oh, well, this makes sense that this is the product of infinite creative potential. And so I'd say even God doesn't know what he was going to turn into, or, I'm even using words like what he's going to turn into. So it, and even it sort of means something. So this unmanifest potential just becomes the manifest, which includes all of us. And so God has become you and I, and become the trees and the rivers, and had no idea about what it was going to become, didn't even know it was becoming. It just was unmanifest, and then the unmanifest became the manifest.
Right.
So from that point of view, we can maybe then have a completely different idea of what God's will means. God's will might just be a description of what is happening as an expression of source. And not even source that is out there, but source that has become the expression. So Roger's words are God's will, but there is no God whose will is being exerted, but rather there is God as creative potentiality that has turned into Roger's words. And that becomes a much less, to me, much closer to the non-dual God, the God that is not a concept. Because when you look at what that concept is saying, it doesn't require you to believe much. Really, what it's pointing at is just what's here in front of us.
Yeah.
It's not really, the important part is not saying or fighting that, oh no, this definitely came from unmanifest potential. All of that is really a framework, an explanation that's very poetic, and it intuitively it feels very right. But the point is not, oh, I know where this came from. It came from unmanifest potential. If someone, you're there saying that the manifestation came from unmanifest infinite creative potential, and someone was picking me out on that, I'd say, look, in the teaching, there's a concept that says whatever I say, whatever is written down, whatever anyone else has said in the past or in the future is a concept, not the truth. And then that person that is obviously got a certain degree of critical thinking, because they're picking me up for what seems to be a lack of critical thinking. Like, how do you know that this came from infinite creative potentiality? So either they need me to convince them that I have some special, really special access to something that seems inaccessible, or I just say, look, in the concept framework, it says whatever I say is a concept, not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So then that person, with their critical thinking capacity, hopefully will say, oh, I get it. I apologize. You're not making a critical thinking error because you have the answer to the critical thinking criticism. And then we all move on, and we're happy. So the concept of God and God's will is really all there for us to become present with what is here, which is essentially the flow of life and our attitude to the flow of life. And hopefully the concepts help us do that, and then focus on the beliefs that say, I am the doer, because that's really the point, is to come to see that I'm not the doer. We don't need to project the doership onto God. Once I'm not the doer dissolves, then I care who the doer is, whether there is a doer, whether there isn't a doer. That is all in the background, let's say. And my mission isn't to know the background. In fact, I know I can't know the background. So once it's done its job, we can let go of the concepts.
Right. So we could say maybe more that God's will is less about God's doership and more about God's beingship. And that aligning ourselves with God's will is to, in 12-step programs, they talk about life on life's terms or God's will. And it's sort of like if an avalanche is coming down a mountain, no amount of personal doership is going to control where that avalanche is going to fall. No amount of personal will is going to prevent you from getting buried under that avalanche just because you have willpower. It's sort of like it's unfolding, it's happening. There's not really any will. It's an unfolding of beingship in relative time, and aligning with God's will just means being.
Yeah, and even yeah, so it's your own being means you know God, which doesn't then mean so essentially it's exactly what you're saying, is that the only place you can be is in your own being, and God is being in theory, and so I would say that God to me is in part that which is illuminating Roger, the source. So the source, we talk about the source of the manifestation as God. And in practical terms, the source of Roger's manifestation or Roger's experience of the manifestation is consciousness functioning through him. If you take that away, then it's like pulling the plug. So to me, the source of Roger's experience is consciousness. And we can call it a personal consciousness, or the consciousness that is at the base of the personal consciousness experience. But essentially, I know that as it arises here. And so God as source might just be a metaphor for what is the God of the human experience, which is your own beingness. So yeah, there's all sorts of twists in how we can read it, but usually there's some beautiful parallels that in the end bring us back to a much more personal understanding of what are at some point in the teaching, they're just concepts that talk about stuff we can never be connected to, really.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Roger. It's really beautiful to be able to spend this time. You were talking the other day about how excited you were when you went to see Ramesh, and you were excited for 9 a.m. And it's funny, where I live in Montreal, it's the satsang start at 9 a.m. and I'm always excited to get up and get my little coffee and come hang out with everyone and in satsang. So just want to express my very deep gratitude and thanks for presenting these teachings and doing this. It's beautiful.
Thank you. That's great. Nice of you to drop in.
Thank you, Rob.
So yeah, I think on that beautiful note, we will wrap it up for the day and see as many of you as feel inclined to join. See you tomorrow.